When I returned from MY trip, there was a note on the kitchen counter in MY husband's handwriting. Handle this old woman. No greeting, no explanation, just that. Upstairs in the East Wing guest room, I found his grandmother, Beatrice Whitmore, locked in from the outside. She was barely breathing, her lips were dry, her hands were cold. When I knelt beside her, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Help me set things right." Then she leaned closer and added something that changed the direction of my life forever. "They have no idea who I really am. If you think age makes a woman powerless, stay with me. And if you've ever been underestimated in your own home, listen carefully. What I learned that night may save you years of silence, or please like or subscribe to my channel if you want more stories like this." I had been gone for 4 days at a literature retreat in Asheville. 4 quiet days discussing Austen, Woolf, and the quiet rebellion of women who refused to be small. I remember thinking as I drove back to the Whitmore estate that peace felt earned. I had remarried 6 years earlier. I am a leaner Ellie Whitmore at 52. I believed I was choosing companionship, not complication. Richard Whitmore, my husband, was charming, accomplished, a real estate developer who knew how to fill a room with confidence. He also knew how to fill silence with promises. What he didn't know was that I listened more than I spoke. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. That has always been my advantage. The house was too quiet when I walked in. No classical music from Judith's sitting room, no clinking of Caleb's espresso machine, no low murmur of business calls from Richard's office, just stillness. The note sat on the marble island. Handle this old woman? The handwriting was Richard's, sharp, impatient. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to understand the intention. It wasn't a request, it was disposal. I didn't call him. I didn't text, I went upstairs. The East Wing hallway felt colder than usual. Mrs. Agnes Porter, the house manager, had always kept that side immaculate for Beatrice. Fresh flowers, open windows, light. But the door to Beatrice's suite was shut, not gently, firmly. I turned the knob, locked from the outside. My pulse slowed instead of racing. That is something women should understand about themselves. When betrayal is real, panic wastes energy. Clarity preserves it. I went to the study drawer where Richard keeps spare keys. They were not there. That told me more than the note. I returned upstairs and knocked. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Nothing. I pressed my ear to the wood, a faint rustle. Then something like breath struggling through fabric. I don't remember deciding to break the lock. I simply did. The door splintered with one solid push of the brass lamp from the hallway table, and there she was, Beatrice Whitmore. 89 years old. The woman who built the Whitmore estate from nothing after her husband died in 1974, retired forensic accountant, matriarch, allegedly fading, except she wasn't fading, she was calculating. But in that moment she looked fragile, pale, a glass of water out of reach, curtains drawn, no call button within sight. "Who locked you in?" I asked quietly. Her eyes opened slowly. Blue, sharp, present, not confused, not lost. Present, her fingers wrapped around my wrist with strength that did not match her frail posture. "They think I'm finished," she whispered. Her voice was thin but deliberate. "Richard, Judith, Caleb," she inhaled slowly. "They moved papers." My mind sharpened. Papers, not pills, not food. Papers. "Help me set things right," she said. Then she looked at me in a way that felt like being weighed. "They have no idea who I really am." That sentence lodged inside my chest. I helped her sit upright. I opened the curtains. I called Mrs. Agnes Porter, who arrived breathless within minutes. Agnes did not look surprised. That unsettled me more than anything. "I was told not to come up here," she said carefully. Told by whom? She did not answer directly. "Mrs. Whitmore has not been eating properly for 3 days. 3 days. And no one mentioned it before I left." Richard had kissed my forehead before my trip and said, "Mother's managing, grandma's resting." Managing, resting, words that conceal neglect elegantly. I gave Beatrice water, small sips. Her hand remained wrapped around mine the entire time, not weak, anchoring. "Where is Richard?" I asked Agnes. "Hilton Head," she replied, "with Mrs. Judith and Mr. Caleb." Of course they were. The annual investment planning weekend. I had never been invited. I was told it was legacy discussion, bloodline matters. I suddenly understood what that note meant. Handle this old woman. It wasn't about care. It was about containment. I turned back to Beatrice. What did they move? Her lips curved slightly, not a smile, something closer to strategy. The trust addendum, she whispered. They think I don't remember the structure. Trust addendum structure. My husband had never once discussed the mechanics of the Whitmore family trust with me, only that it was secure and untouchable. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Control the paper, control the power. That was the first lesson she gave me. I did not yet understand the depth of it, but I understood enough to know this was not about elder neglect. This was about inheritance redirection. And someone believed an 89-year-old woman was too fragile to notice. I stood and scanned the room, file cabinet drawers slightly ajar, desk cleaner than usual. Beatrice was meticulous. That room used to hum with order, now it felt edited. Agnes, I said softly, who has been in this room? She hesitated. Mr. Caleb brought Mr. Holloway by last Tuesday. Graham Holloway, the estate attorney, longtime Whitmore legal advisor, meticulous, unemotional. Loyal to the family structure, or so I thought. Why would the attorney visit without notifying Beatrice's direct contact? Unless she wasn't meant to know. Beatrice's eyes opened again. He didn't bring Holloway for me, she said quietly. He brought him for signatures. That's when my stomach turned cold. Signatures. Judith believed wealth should stay in the bloodline. I was not blood, I was marriage. Temporary, replaceable. But Beatrice, she was origin. If they could prove incompetence, if they could shift decision authority, if they could alter distribution rights, everything changes. Did you sign anything? I asked. She gave me a look that nearly made me laugh despite the tension. I taught forensic auditing for 20 years, she said. Do you think I sign without reading? That was when I realized something crucial. Beatrice had not been declining, she had been observing. And perhaps pretending more weakness than she had, just enough to see who revealed themselves. I helped her to the sitting chair by the window. Her breathing steadied. Ellie, she said, using my name deliberately, do you know why they underestimated you? I didn't answer. Because you are kind, she said, and kind women are often mistaken for harmless women. She squeezed my hand. Kindness is not permission. That sentence echoed my own belief so closely it startled me. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. And suddenly the noise of the Whitmore family made sense. Caleb's restless spending, Richard's urgency around expansion projects, Judith's constant talk of protecting legacy. They weren't protecting legacy. They were positioning themselves before the source disappeared, and they thought the source was fading. Beatrice leaned back. There is a clause, she whispered. Hidden in plain sight, activated only if coercion is proven. My heart slowed even further. Coercion, they think the trust flows automatically to Richard upon my cognitive decline certification. She smiled faintly. But I wrote the structure. I sat very still. What does the clause do? I asked. Her eyes held mine. It reroutes control entirely. Reroutes. Entirely. I didn't yet know to whom or how, but I understood this. That note on the counter was not about burden, it was about desperation. They were rushing something. And now they were gone for 4 days, leaving me to handle what they thought was a liability. They had no idea what they had handed me. As the evening settled over the estate, I sat beside Beatrice's chair watching the sun fade through restored curtains. Agnes prepared broth. I called no one. I alerted no one. I waited. Because sometimes the most powerful move a woman can make is not immediate confrontation. It is quiet alignment. Before she drifted to sleep, Beatrice opened her eyes one last time and said, "Tomorrow we call Holloway, not Richard." That was when I understood this was not a family disagreement. This was a structural war. And I had just been invited to the center of it. What I did not yet know was how far Richard had already gone or who else knew about the clause. But I would soon find out. And when I did, everything inside the Whitmore name would shift. The next morning I woke before the sun, not because I was anxious, because clarity has a rhythm and I have learned to rise when it calls. Beatrice was already awake, sitting upright, dressed, waiting. That alone told me something had shifted. The frail grandmother they believed could barely lift a teacup was reviewing documents at her writing desk when I entered. Her posture was straight, her mind sharper than any of them suspected. "They'll return tomorrow afternoon," I said quietly. "Yes," she replied without looking up. "Which means today belongs to us." There is something powerful about two women who decide to move without announcing it. No drama. No raised voices, just alignment. I made coffee. Real coffee, not the diluted decaf Judith insisted Beatrice drink for her heart. I handed her the cup. She wrapped both hands around it and said, "Call Graham Holloway, not Richard. Not Caleb, not Judith, the attorney. Now understand this." Graham Holloway had represented the Whitmore estate for over 30 years. He had drafted amendments, layered trusts, asset shields. He was precise, detached. A man who rarely blinked unnecessarily. But I also knew something else. He respected Beatrice deeply. When I dialed his private number, he answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said formally. "How may I assist?" "This is a leaner," I replied evenly. "Beatrice is with me. We need to review the trust structure in person today." Silence. "Then I'll arrive within the hour." He did not ask why. That told me everything. While we waited, Beatrice instructed Agnes to retrieve a locked file box from the attic storage, one Richard had insisted be archived last winter. Agnes did not question. She never does. Loyalty is quiet, not loud. When the box was placed on the desk, Beatrice ran her fingers over it slowly. "They assume documentation disappears with age," she said. "It doesn't, it waits." I sat across from her. "What exactly did they attempt?" She looked at me steadily. "They tried to activate succession under incapacity." My breath stilled. "Incapacity requires 2 medical certifications," she continued. "And a trustee petition?" "Who filed it?" I asked. "Caleb initiated the inquiry," she said calmly. "Richard approved it." "Of course he did." Caleb Whitmore, 34, investment analyst, publicly composed. Privately hemorrhaging cash through speculative trading and lifestyle debt. I had seen the signs: late-night tension, increased calls, Judith's subtle remarks about future security. They weren't waiting for inheritance. They were accelerating it. "And Holloway?" I asked. "He delayed it," Beatrice replied. Interesting. Before I could ask more, the front door opened. Graham Holloway entered precisely on time, navy suit, silver tie, expression unreadable. He stepped into the study and stopped when he saw Beatrice seated upright, fully alert. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. "Graham," she replied. "Sit." He obeyed. No pleasantries, no theatrics. Beatrice slid a document across the desk. "Explain what they requested." Holloway adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Caleb Whitmore submitted preliminary documentation seeking activation of Trust Provision 8A succession upon cognitive impairment." "And," she prompted. "I declined to file formal motion," he said evenly. "Why?" I asked. His eyes flicked to me briefly, measuring. "Because," he replied, "I had no medical certification confirming impairment." Beatrice's lips curved slightly. "And because," a pause, "and because the trust contains a secondary clause under 8F." There it was. The clause. "Explain it," I said quietly. Holloway folded his hands. "If coercion, manipulation, or undue influence is detected in attempts to activate incapacity succession, controlling authority immediately transfers to an independent fiduciary selected solely by Mrs. Whitmore." I felt something shift in the room. "Meaning?" I pressed. "Meaning," he continued calmly, "if this clause is triggered, Richard Whitmore loses all direct control over estate assets. Permanently." The silence that followed was not fear, it was understanding. Richard had no idea. Caleb had no idea. Judith, obsessed with bloodline control, had no idea. Because the clause was embedded inside structural language only someone fluent in forensic accounting would design. Beatrice designed it. "They assumed I forgot my own architecture," she said softly. "Control the paper, control the power." Holloway nodded once. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you believe coercion occurred, we must document it immediately." I leaned forward. "What qualifies as coercion?" "Isolation," he replied. "Restricted access, attempted medical override, financial urgency tied to incapacity activation." I exchanged a glance with Beatrice. Locked doors, withheld information. Sudden trustee inquiries. It was aligning too cleanly. "And if we prove it?" I asked. "Then succession authority shifts away from Richard Whitmore and his direct heirs." "Shift to whom?" I asked carefully. Holloway looked at Beatrice. She did not blink. "To the fiduciary Mrs. Whitmore names." "And have you named one?" I asked her. She met my eyes directly. "Yes." My pulse slowed again. "And who is it?" She leaned back in her chair, calm, steady, certain. You, for a moment the air itself seemed to thin. Me, not Caleb, not Richard, not Judith, me, Eleanor Whitmore, the literature professor they viewed as ornamental. The second wife, the temporary attachment. The woman who married into legacy. They never realized legacy had already shifted. Holloway spoke carefully. If Mrs. Whitmore signs formal confirmation today and we file preemptive documentation citing coercion attempt, control transfers immediately. I felt the weight of what this meant. This wasn't revenge, this was structural displacement. Beatrice looked at me with something deeper than approval, recognition. They underestimated you, she said quietly. That is their first mistake. I thought of Richard's note. Handle this old woman. Yes, I was handling it, just not in the way he intended. What happens when they return? I asked. Holloway's tone did not change. They will believe succession is progressing in their favor. And when they discover it isn't, he allowed the smallest pause. They will reveal themselves. There it was again. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the estate grounds. 6 acres of manicured power. Gardens Judith curated for status. Driveway Richard paraded clients through. A house Caleb assumed was inevitable. None of them understood architecture. Real architecture isn't walls, it's clauses. Behind me, Beatrice signed the confirmation document with a steady hand. No tremor, no hesitation. Holloway witnessed it, sealed it, closed his case. Mrs. Whitmore, he said to me before leaving, I advise you to observe carefully when they return. Do not confront, let them speak. Why? I asked. Because when people believe they've won, they talk too much. As the front door closed behind him, Beatrice exhaled slowly. It has begun, she said. I sat beside her again. Are you afraid? I asked. She smiled faintly. No. I am disappointed. There is a difference. Fear weakens, disappointment clarifies. By late afternoon, Agnes confirmed Richard's SUV had crossed into state lines. They would be home tomorrow, confident, relaxed. Believing succession paperwork was in motion. They had no idea control had already shifted beneath their feet. That night, as I prepared tea for Beatrice, she said something that stayed with me. Ellie, wealth does not corrupt. It exposes. And what has it exposed? I asked. She looked toward the darkened hallway. Who believes I am already gone? Upstairs, I placed a chair quietly outside her door, not because I feared intrusion. Because I wanted to hear footsteps. Tomorrow, Richard would walk through that door believing he was closer to control. Tomorrow, Caleb would assume inevitability. Tomorrow, Judith would smile that polished smile of inherited superiority. And tomorrow, I would watch them carefully, because the clause was only the first movement. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew, was that activating coercion protection created a paper trail, and paper trails attract attention. Especially from people like Agent Lillian Cruz. They thought this was a family matter. It was about to become something far larger. They returned Sunday at 3:12 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was watching the driveway camera feed on my phone. Not obsessively. Calmly, preparation sharpens awareness. Richard's black SUV rolled through the gates first. Judith's pearl-colored sedan followed. Caleb drove separately as he often did when he wanted the illusion of independence. 3 cars, 3 expressions of confidence. They believed they were coming home to momentum. They had no idea they were stepping into containment. I was seated in the living room when the front door opened. Not upstairs, not hiding, waiting. Beatrice was in her usual chair by the window, upright, dressed, alert. The curtains open wide, sunlight pouring in. Agnes stood discreetly near the hallway, silent as ever. Richard stepped in first. Sunglasses, weekend tan. The relaxed stride of a man who believes he has secured his future. He stopped mid-step when he saw Beatrice sitting fully composed. "Grandmother," he said slowly, "you're up." Beatrice looked at him steadily. "I usually am." Judith entered behind him, lips pursed in polite surprise. Caleb followed last, scanning the room with that detached calculation he mistakes for intelligence. Then Richard saw me. "You're back early," he said. "I live here," I replied evenly. "It isn't early." His eyes flicked toward the kitchen island. The note was gone. I had folded it and placed it inside my desk drawer. Evidence doesn't belong on counters. Judith approached Beatrice first. She leaned down with theatrical concern. "Mother, you look stronger today." I was never weak, Beatrice replied. The air shifted slightly. Richard cleared his throat. We were worried about you, he said. Silence. I watched his posture carefully. There was tension in his jaw. He was assessing variables. Had she signed? Had Holloway filed? Had the motion progressed? Richard, I said calmly, how was Hilton Head? He smiled automatically. Productive. For investments? I asked. For legacy planning, Judith corrected smoothly. Legacy, that word again, always spoken like ownership. Caleb finally spoke. We met with advisors. Which advisors? I asked. His eyes flicked toward his father before returning to me. Financial consultants? Interesting, not Graham Holloway. Beatrice folded her hands in her lap. Caleb, she said gently, did you bring the trust documents you were reviewing? There it was, direct. Caleb hesitated for half a second too long. What documents? The ones you requested from Mr. Holloway last Tuesday, she replied. Richard's shoulders stiffened. Judith's smile froze. Caleb recovered quickly. Just routine evaluation, great-grandmother, standard procedure. Routine for whom? I asked. Richard stepped forward slightly. Ellie, this isn't your concern. And there it was, the dismissal, temporary wife, peripheral voice. I stood slowly, not confrontational, balanced. It becomes my concern when locks are installed on bedroom doors, I said quietly. Judith inhaled sharply. That was for safety. Whose? I asked. No one answered. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. Richard, she said, tell me what Provision 8F states. He blinked. Excuse me, Provision 8F, she repeated. You were eager to activate 8A. Surely you read 8F. Caleb's expression changed first. Subtle, a flicker of uncertainty. Richard recovered faster. We were advised 8A was the relevant clause. By whom? I asked. Silence. Judith intervened smoothly. Mother, we are only trying to protect you. At your age, structures must be simplified. Beatrice's eyes sharpened. I designed the structure. That landed heavier than any accusation. Richard shifted strategies. Grandmother, we just want to ensure continuity. If anything happens, anything has already happened, she interrupted. You petitioned incapacity without medical certification. Caleb stepped in. Preliminary inquiry only? I watched him carefully. His composure was thinner than usual. There was pressure there, financial pressure, desperation masquerading as ambition. Richard's voice hardened slightly. We're not having this discussion in front of, he gestured subtly toward me. Say it, I said calmly. In front of someone who doesn't understand the family structure, he finished. Silence. I felt it then, not anger, clarity. Kindness is not permission. You mean someone who isn't blood, I replied evenly. Judith met my eyes without warmth. The Whitmore estate has always remained within direct lineage. And yet, Beatrice said softly, control has never required blood. Only competence? That was when I saw it. The crack. Richard did not know about the fiduciary shift. Caleb did not know the petition-triggered review. Judith did not know the clause rerouted authority. They believed they were ahead. Have you spoken with Holloway? I asked Richard. Not since Friday, he replied quickly, too quickly. Strange, I said. He was here. Richard's eyes snapped toward Beatrice. Why? She held his gaze calmly. Because I asked him to be. Judith's composure slipped. Mother, you should have informed us. I am not required to inform those attempting to remove me. The room went still. Richard's tone shifted again, this time edged with something colder. No one is removing you. Beatrice tilted her head slightly. Then why was my room locked? Caleb exhaled sharply. That was temporary. For 3 days, I asked. Richard's jaw tightened. This is becoming dramatic. No, I said quietly. It's becoming documented. That word landed differently, documented. Caleb's fingers twitched. Richard's posture straightened. Judith's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. What exactly are you implying? Richard asked. I'm not implying anything, I replied. I'm observing. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide, and in that silence they began to reveal themselves. Caleb spoke first. Look, the market has shifted. Liquidity matters. If something were to happen to great-grandmother suddenly, estate transitions could freeze assets for months. We were being proactive. There it was, liquidity, months, sudden, not grief, not care. Cash flow. Beatrice watched him the way a professor watches a student who has just failed publicly. You speak as though I am already gone. Richard stepped forward. We are preparing for reality. And what reality is that? I asked. He looked at me directly now. That time doesn't wait for anyone. No, I agreed softly. But consequences do. That was when the phone rang, not mine, Richard's. He glanced at the screen, his expression flickered. He declined the call. Who was that? Judith asked quietly. Work, he replied, but I saw the name reflected briefly on the polished surface of the foyer mirror behind him. Graham Holloway. He wasn't answering his attorney. Because he didn't know what Holloway would say, Beatrice leaned back calmly. Richard, I suggest you return Mr. Holloway's call. And why would I do that? He asked, tension creeping into his voice. Because, she said gently, the structure you attempted to activate has already responded. The air in the room thickened. What does that mean? Caleb demanded. Beatrice's gaze moved slowly from grandson to son to daughter-in-law. It means, she said quietly, control no longer sits where you believe it does. No one moved. Richard's confidence cracked first. Explain yourself. I don't need to, she replied. The paperwork will. And that was the moment everything shifted, not because she raised her voice, not because she accused, but because certainty left their faces. They thought this was a simple acceleration. They did not realize it was a trigger. Richard's phone rang again. This time he answered. Yes. Pause. His face changed, not panic, calculation unraveling. We need to discuss this privately, he said tightly. Speaker, Beatrice said calmly. He hesitated. Speaker, she repeated. Slowly, reluctantly, Richard pressed the button. Graham Holloway's voice filled the room. Calm, precise. Richard, I'm informing you that due to irregularities detected in the incapacity inquiry, Provision 8F has been formally acknowledged. Control of a state decision authority has been transferred effective immediately. Silence. Richard's voice went flat. Transferred to whom? A pause. To the designated fiduciary named by Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore. Richard's eyes moved toward me. Understanding dawned slowly, but not fully, not yet, because there was something else he didn't know, and it was already in motion beyond this house. Agent Lillian Cruz had received a notification triggered by flagged financial acceleration patterns tied to the trust inquiry. Paper trails attract attention, especially when large estates shift unexpectedly. Richard thought this was internal. It wasn't anymore. As the call ended, I remained standing, calm, observing. Beatrice folded her hands once more. You believed I was fading, she said softly. You never considered I was watching. And as I looked at my husband, at the man who wrote "Handle this old woman like she was a chore," I understood something deeply important for every woman listening. Never let anyone mistake your silence for surrender, because sometimes silence is simply preparation. And tomorrow, preparation would meet exposure. The most dangerous moment in a powerful man's life is not when he is accused. It's when he realizes he is no longer in control of the paper. After Graham Holloway's call ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't confusion, it was recalibration. Richard's mind was moving fast. I could see it behind his eyes. He was calculating exposure, risk, narrative control. Judith was doing the same, only socially. Caleb looked pale. That surprised me most. He wasn't angry, he was afraid. What exactly did you do? Richard asked Beatrice, his voice carefully neutral. Beatrice adjusted the silk shawl around her shoulders. Frail hands, razor mind. I corrected an assumption, she said calmly. You transferred control, Judith pressed. To whom? Beatrice's gaze shifted toward me, not dramatically, simply deliberately. Richard followed her eyes, slowly. No, he said. Yes, she replied. The room shifted again, not loudly. Structurally, Richard turned fully toward me. You! I didn't smile, I didn't react. Provision 8F allows a fiduciary substitution when coercive incapacity proceedings are initiated without medical certification, I said evenly. You should have read past 8A, Caleb blinked. You knew about 8F. I read, I said quietly. That's what literature professors do. Judith's composure cracked just slightly. This is absurd. A leaner is not blood, neither is competence, Beatrice said gently. Richard stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. This is temporary. No, I replied, it's effective. He studied my face, searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Control of what exactly? Caleb asked. Beatrice answered. Asset movement approvals, trust distributions, liquidation authorizations, real estate leverage. And most importantly, internal audits. That last phrase landed like a dropped glass. Internal audits. Richard's jaw tightened. There is nothing to audit. Mrs. Agnes Porter, who had been silent near the hallway, finally spoke. Mr. Whitmore, there is always something to audit. Richard shot her a look of irritation. He had always underestimated Agnes. Most people did. 30 years in this house had taught her how to disappear into corners. It had also taught her how to observe everything. Caleb spoke quickly. Grandmother, this feels extreme. Does it? Beatrice asked softly. You attempted to declare me incompetent. That was precautionary, and so is this. Silence again. But this silence wasn't fragile, it was controlled. Richard straightened his jacket. Fine, we'll review the paperwork. Graham will clarify. He already did, I replied. That's when his phone buzzed again, a message this time. He glanced at it reflexively, his face shifted. What is it? Judith demanded. He hesitated. Nothing. Agnes stepped forward quietly. Mr. Whitmore, you might want to read it aloud. He looked at her sharply. Why would I? Because it concerns the trust's banking partners, she said calmly. Richard's eyes snapped back to the phone. He read it again. Slower, Caleb moved closer. Dad, Richard swallowed slightly. The bank flagged unusual inquiry attempts tied to the estate portfolio. Flagged? Judith repeated. Yes, they've initiated compliance review. Compliance review. Now Caleb looked truly unsettled. That triggers federal reporting thresholds, he said under his breath. And that was when the second shoe dropped. The front gate intercom chimed. All eyes shifted toward the hallway. Agnes didn't rush, she never rushed. She walked calmly to the panel and pressed the button. Yes, a woman's voice came through, steady and professional. Agent Lillian Cruz, Federal Financial Crimes Division. I have an appointment regarding the Whitmore Trust. The temperature in the room changed. Richard recovered first. This is harassment. Is it? I asked softly. Judith's fingers tightened around her purse strap. We are a respected family. Respect does not exempt review, Beatrice replied. Agnes opened the gates. Within minutes, Agent Lillian Cruz stood in our foyer, mid-40s, navy suit, minimal expression. The kind of calm that makes guilty people talk too much. Good afternoon, she said evenly. I understand there have been recent movements and attempted accelerations regarding the Whitmore Trust. Richard stepped forward smoothly. Agent, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I hope so, she replied. She didn't sit until Beatrice gestured for her to. That detail mattered. Agent Cruz opened a slim portfolio. We received notification from 2 banking institutions and 1 estate compliance auditor regarding unusual access requests and early distribution modeling inconsistent with original trust design. Caleb went rigid. Richard's voice sharpened. We were evaluating liquidity options. Without activated medical authority, she asked calmly. He hesitated just slightly. Judith interjected. This is a private family matter. Ma'am, Agent Cruz said gently, it became federal the moment structured assets tied to interstate holdings were flagged. Silence again. I watched Richard carefully. His instinct now was not dominance, it was damage control. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. Agent Cruz, I requested your presence. That startled everyone, including me. Richard turned sharply. You what? She ignored him. I suspected accelerated leverage planning tied to speculative debt exposure. Caleb's face drained of color. Agent Cruz glanced at him briefly, just a glance, but it lingered long enough to register. Speculative debt exposure? She repeated. Beatrice nodded. I may be old, I am not blind. I felt something shift inside me then. This was no longer about a note on a counter, it was about structural greed. About entitlement colliding with documentation. Agent Cruz closed her portfolio. Will require access to distribution requests, inquiry logs, and recent communications with third-party advisors. Richard's composure thinned. You're implying wrongdoing? I'm implying review, she replied. Wrongdoing reveals itself. And that is when something fascinating happened. Caleb spoke too quickly. There was no transfer. We didn't actually execute anything. Agent Cruz's eyes moved toward him slowly. You attempted. He said nothing. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide, And in that silence, Caleb revealed fear, not outrage, fear. Richard shifted tone. Agent Cruz, this is unnecessary. My grandmother is elderly. She may have misinterpreted. Finish that sentence carefully, I said quietly. He stopped. Agent Cruz observed us all, measuring reactions, timing. I'll be in contact within 48 hours, she said calmly. Do not alter, delete, or restructure any financial records. That line hit hardest. Because now, if they tried to move anything, it would look like obstruction. After she left, no one spoke for a long moment. Richard turned to me slowly. You set this up. No, I replied evenly. You triggered it. Judith's voice was low and cold. You're destroying this family. No, Beatrice said softly. I'm protecting it. Richard stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as decorative, not as temporary, not as irrelevant. You think this makes you powerful? He asked. I met his eyes calmly. No. I think it makes you accountable. And that was the moment I understood something every woman listening should understand deeply. Men who believe age equals weakness often forget that experience builds pattern recognition. And once you see the pattern, you don't need to scream. You just need to document. Richard thought the investigation would scare me. He didn't realize it was only beginning, because the internal audit Beatrice authorized. It hadn't reached its most revealing discovery yet. There is a specific sound a man makes when his future begins to unravel. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the silence right after he realizes the numbers don't favor him anymore. The morning after Agent Lillian Cruz left, the house felt different. Not chaotic. Controlled. Too controlled. Richard didn't go to the office. Caleb didn't leave for his firm. Judith stayed in her suite, making calls in low, urgent tones that carried down the hallway like perfume, subtle but unmistakable. Beatrice asked for tea at exactly 9 o'clock a.m. Agnes brought it, of course. I joined her by the window. You saw his face, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. He didn't expect federal attention. No, she stirred her tea slowly. Men like Richard believe consequences are local. I understood that deeply. He had always operated within controlled environments, boardrooms, golf courses, fundraising dinners, spaces where reputation insulated behavior. He never accounted for systems larger than himself. At 9:17 a.m., Graham Holloway arrived. He didn't smile when he entered. That alone told me something significant. Richard met him in the study. The door remained partially open, not wide enough to invite us. Just enough to suggest transparency. That performance was intentional, but silence reveals what noise tries to hide. Caleb joined them 10 minutes later. I watched from the hallway reflection in the antique mirror. His shoulders were tense. Not indignant, anxious. That was my first real clue. When they emerged 40 minutes later, Richard looked controlled again. Too controlled. Caleb looked pale. Graham's expression remained neutral. Beatrice spoke first. Well, Graham removed his glasses slowly. The internal audit has identified leverage exposure tied to non-trust real estate developments. Judith's voice sharpened. Speak plainly. He did. Caleb has been using projected inheritance modeling to secure personal credit extensions. The room stilled. Richard turned sharply toward his son. What? Caleb exhaled. It wasn't illegal. Yet, Graham added calmly. I felt it then, the real fracture. Caleb wasn't drowning because of market fluctuation. He was drowning because he had borrowed against expectation, against certainty, against the belief that the Whitmore estate would eventually become his. How much? Richard demanded. Caleb hesitated. That hesitation told me the number was larger than anyone wanted to hear. 7 figures, Graham said. Judith gasped. Not out of concern for Caleb, out of concern for reputation. Richard stepped toward his son. You leveraged projections from the trust? I used forward models, Caleb replied defensively. Everyone does. Not with irrevocable structures, Graham corrected. And not during active fiduciary review. Beatrice didn't look surprised. She looked disappointed. How exposed are we? Richard asked. Graham's gaze shifted briefly toward me before returning to Richard. The trust itself is insulated. However, if lenders believe expected inheritance is compromised, they may accelerate collection. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. They won't. They already have, Graham said quietly. That was the second fracture. Richard's composure cracked. You're telling me my son is being margin called on money he doesn't even have yet? Yes. Judith sank slowly into a chair. This cannot become public. Agent Cruz's words echoed in my mind. Do not alter or restructure any financial records. Richard turned toward me suddenly. This is because of you. No, I said evenly. This is because of assumptions. He stepped closer. If you hadn't interfered, if you hadn't attempted to remove Beatrice, I replied, the audit would not have activated. Silence. Caleb looked at me differently then, not with dismissal. With calculation, you knew, he said quietly. I suspected, I answered. You suspected me? I suspected pressure. That's when something subtle shifted in him. Fear turned into something sharper, self-preservation. What does Agent Cruz know? He asked Graham. Enough to continue reviewing, Graham replied. Judith stood abruptly. We need narrative control immediately. Philanthropic event, press release. Something stabilizing. Beatrice almost smiled. You cannot PR your way out of documentation. Richard turned to Graham. Can this be contained? Containment requires compliance, Graham said. And transparency? Richard's jaw tightened. Transparency was not his language. The day stretched heavy. Phone calls, closed doors, quiet arguments. By late afternoon, Agnes approached me quietly in the kitchen. They're searching files upstairs, she said softly. For what? Anything that moves. I nodded. That was expected. Panic masquerading as strategy. What else do you know? I asked her. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. Mr. Caleb has been receiving calls from a private equity lender in Manhattan. They're less patient than banks. That mattered. Private lenders don't negotiate with sentiment. They enforce with speed. I found Caleb alone on the terrace just before sunset. He didn't look at me when I stepped outside. You're enjoying this, he said flatly. No, I replied honestly. I'm observing it. You think I'm reckless. I think you believed something was guaranteed. He laughed softly. It was. Nothing is guaranteed, I said quietly. Not even blood. That line landed harder than I intended. He turned toward me then. If the trust freezes distributions long-term, I'm finished. I studied his face carefully. Beneath the entitlement was something else, desperation. How finished? I asked. Bankruptcy at best, he said. Fraud investigation at worst. There it was, not hypothetical exposure, real risk. You're not angry at me, he said slowly. No, why? Because anger clouds pattern recognition. He swallowed. What would you do? I held his gaze. Stop performing certainty, start restructuring truth. He didn't answer, but he heard me. That night Richard came to our bedroom late. He didn't turn on the lights. You've humiliated me, he said quietly. No, I replied. You underestimated me. He stood in the dark for a long moment. You think you're protecting her. I am. And what about this family? I sat up slowly. Protection and accountability are not opposites. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand what's at stake. I do, I said. Control. Silence stretched between us, not intimate, structural. For the first time in 6 years, I realized something with complete clarity. Richard had never seen me as a partner, only proximity. And proximity is not power. Power is paper. Downstairs in Beatrice's study, Agnes locked the filing cabinet containing the original trust architecture. Upstairs, Caleb drafted emails he would later regret. In his office, Richard called 3 advisors who would distance themselves by morning. And somewhere across the city, Agent Lillian Cruz reviewed preliminary findings that would make this no longer a private family matter. Because what Richard still didn't know, what none of them understood yet, was that Caleb's debt trail didn't begin with inheritance modeling. It began with something far more deliberate, and it had Beatrice's name attached to it. There is a difference between being reckless and being positioned. And what I discovered that morning changed everything I thought I understood about Caleb's debt. It began with a single document. Agnes brought it to me quietly before breakfast. She didn't knock loudly, she never did. She simply placed a thin folder on the edge of the kitchen island and said, "You should see this before Mr. Whitmore does." Inside was a personal guarantee agreement. Private equity lender, Manhattan-based. Aggressive, unforgiving, Caleb Whitmore borrower, but that wasn't what made my breath slow. The secondary referenced collateral wasn't projected inheritance. It was a conditional advisory endorsement tied to Beatrice Whitmore's financial oversight reputation. In other words, Caleb had used his great-grandmother's name, not forged, not exactly leveraged. He had implied proximity to her approval, to her legacy, to her influence in financial circles that still remembered her from decades past. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. Caleb hadn't been borrowing because he was foolish. He had been borrowing because he believed Beatrice's name would protect him. I walked into Beatrice's study without announcing myself. She was reviewing ledgers, actual paper ledgers, the way only someone who trusts ink more than servers does. "You knew," I said quietly. She didn't look up immediately. "About which part?" "Caleb's guarantees." She closed the ledger slowly. "Yes." The simplicity of that answer unsettled me more than denial would have. "You let him?" "I observed him." "That's not the same thing." She looked at me then, fully, sharp, measuring. "Ellie, when a man believes a name protects him, he eventually uses it. The question is whether you discover it before the lender does." My pulse slowed, pattern recognition settling into place. "You were watching to see how far he would go." "Yes. And he went far enough." That was when the deeper truth began to surface. Caleb hadn't expected to pay the loans back himself. He expected early distribution leverage. He expected the trust acceleration Richard and Judith were quietly planning. He wasn't reckless. He was synchronized. "Richard knew," I said. Beatrice didn't answer. That silence was confirmation. Mid-morning, Agent Lillian Cruz returned. No dramatic entry this time, no raised voices, just presence. Richard attempted charm immediately. It didn't land. Caleb tried detachment. It cracked. Judith tried indignation. It dissolved under documentation. Agent Cruz sat at the long dining table and opened a file. "Mr. Caleb Whitmore," she said evenly, "did you secure private equity funding referencing anticipated trust liquidity events?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Forward modeling is common. Answer the question." "Yes." "Did you have formal authorization to imply advisory endorsement from Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore?" Silence. "I didn't imply endorsement," he said carefully. "You referenced her continued oversight involvement," she replied. "We have the email." Richard turned toward him sharply. "You emailed them?" Caleb didn't look at him. "It was contextual?" Agent Cruz's eyes moved slowly between them. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Caleb continued talking, over-explaining, exactly as she anticipated. "I never said she guaranteed anything. I just clarified that she remained intellectually active in estate architecture." "And did she authorize that clarification?" Another silence. "No," Richard exhaled sharply. "This is blown out of proportion." Agent Cruz didn't react. "Mr. Whitmore, your son's loan agreements contain clauses contingent upon anticipated trust fluidity. That fluidity was triggered prematurely. That premature trigger initiated federal review. Translation, they tried to move the money before it was structurally available." Judith finally spoke. "There was no fraud." "Intent is evaluated through pattern," Agent Cruz replied calmly. "Pattern?" The word echoed. Caleb's pattern was clear. Debt right arrow leverage projections, right arrow accelerate trust review, right arrow secure liquidity, right arrow repay lenders, right arrow retain image. And somewhere in that chain, Beatrice was supposed to be quiet. But she wasn't. When Agent Cruz left, the house felt smaller, not physically, morally. Richard cornered Caleb in the study. "I didn't need to hear every word. Tone carries enough." "You jeopardized everything?" "I assumed the acceleration would go through." "You assumed." "You told me it would." Silence. There it was. Richard hadn't just known, he had reassured him. When they emerged, Richard's confidence had shifted from control to containment. "We need alignment," he said to me that evening. "Alignment with what?" I asked. "With each other." That almost made me laugh. "You wrote handle this old woman," I said evenly. "That wasn't alignment." He didn't deny it. That was the most telling part. "You're overreacting," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "You're underestimating consequence." Upstairs, Beatrice called Graham Holloway privately. "I didn't hear the conversation. I didn't need to." Agnes later confirmed one detail. "Mr. Holloway is restructuring protective layers," she told me. "How many layers are there?" I asked. Agnes smiled slightly. "More than Mr. Richard ever bothered to count." That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid. Because I was thinking. Caleb had leveraged Beatrice's name. Richard had supported accelerated review. Judith had protected image, but none of them had asked the most important question. Why would a forensic accountant design a trust with only one defensive clause? The next morning, Beatrice summoned us all, not dramatically, just a request. We gathered in the sitting room. Even Caleb came without resistance. That alone told me something had shifted. Beatrice looked smaller in her chair, frail hands resting on folded documents, but her eyes were alert. I have reviewed the internal audit, she began. I have reviewed the debt exposure. I have reviewed the attempted acceleration. Richard folded his arms, defensive. Caleb avoided eye contact. Judith sat perfectly composed. Beatrice continued, you all believed the primary risk was distribution. No one spoke. It wasn't, she said softly. Richard frowned. Then what is? She slid a single envelope across the table. Toward me, not toward Richard, not toward Caleb, toward me. Richard's head snapped in my direction. What is that? Beatrice held my gaze as I opened it. Inside was a notarized amendment dated 6 years ago, the year I married into this family. And the clause it contained changed the entire power structure of the Whitmore estate. There is something deeply unsettling about holding a document that changes your position in a room while everyone else still believes you're powerless. When I unfolded the notarized amendment, my hands did not tremble. That surprised me. 6 years ago, I had walked into this family as Richard's second wife. Temporary, decorative, replaceable. Now I was holding language that made me structural. Richard's voice cut through the silence. What is it? I didn't answer immediately. Silence reveals what noise tries to hide. Beatrice watched me carefully, not with warmth, with evaluation. It's dated the week after our wedding, I said slowly. Judith's eyes narrowed. Mother? Beatrice ignored her. Read it aloud, Alina. So I did. The amendment stated that in the event of a forced or coercive incapacity inquiry initiated by direct descendants without independent medical certification, fiduciary oversight of all discretionary estate functions would transfer to an external appointee selected solely by Beatrice Whitmore. That appointee was named in the final paragraph, Alina Whitmore. The room went very, very quiet. Richard blinked once. That's impossible. It's notarized, I replied calmly, and witnessed by Graham Holloway. All eyes turned to Graham. He didn't flinch. It is valid, he said evenly. Judith's composure cracked. Mother, you made her the controlling fiduciary? Temporarily conditional, Beatrice corrected, triggered by behavior. Richard's jaw tightened. You didn't tell me. Beatrice tilted her head slightly. You didn't ask. Caleb finally spoke, voice thin. What does this actually mean? I answered him. It means I have authority to freeze distributions, block asset leverage, initiate forensic review, and restructure beneficiary conditions. His face drained. You can't. I can. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't confusion, it was recalculation. Richard stepped toward me slowly. You knew about this? No, I said truthfully. Not until 5 minutes ago. That seemed to unsettle him even more. So this is what this is, he demanded. A takeover? No, I replied evenly. It's a safeguard. Judith stood abruptly. This is a betrayal of blood. Beatrice's voice was soft but firm. Blood does not guarantee integrity. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. If you freeze distributions, I default. That is not my primary concern, I said. He looked at me then, not dismissive, not detached. Human. It should be. Silence. He was right about one thing, consequences ripple. But leverage reveals character faster than crisis ever could. Richard changed tactics. His voice softened, almost reasonable. Ellie, this is emotional overreach. We made a precautionary inquiry, that's all. You installed a lock on an 89-year-old woman's door, I replied quietly. That was for safety? For control, I corrected. He inhaled sharply. You're enjoying this power. No, I said calmly. I'm stabilizing risk. Graham cleared his throat. The amendment also contains an additional clause. Of course it did. Beatrice never built single-layer protection. What clause? Judith demanded. Graham removed another document. If the fiduciary transfer is triggered due to coercive action, a mandatory character review of all primary beneficiaries is activated. Caleb blinked. Character review? Beatrice's eyes sharpened. Financial behavior patterns. Ethical exposure, debt leverage, litigation history. Richard went still. You're auditing us? No, I said quietly. The structure is. Agent Lillian Cruz's earlier visit suddenly felt less reactive and more inevitable. Caleb's voice dropped. If this review finds instability, what happens? I looked down at the amendment again, then back at him. Beneficiary percentages can be reallocated. Judith's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. To whom? Beatrice answered. To stability. Richard stared at me as if trying to recognize the woman he married. You think you're untouchable now, he said softly. No, I replied. I think you misjudged me. That hit harder. For 6 years I had been quiet at dinners, observant at board events, supportive in public. He thought silence meant small. He forgot silence also means recording, learning, waiting. Caleb spoke again, but this time without arrogance. If I cooperate, does that matter? It matters, I said evenly, but cooperation is not confession, it's correction. Judith laughed sharply. Listen to her, quoting morality like it's law. It often becomes law, I replied. Beatrice leaned back in her chair, almost satisfied. I did not build this estate to be consumed by entitlement, she said quietly. I built it to endure. Richard turned toward her. And you think giving it to her ensures endurance? I think giving it to the person who wasn't trying to accelerate my death ensures endurance. The words landed like a stone dropped into water. No one denied it. Because denial would require explanation, and explanation would require truth. The afternoon dissolved into silence and separate rooms. Richard made calls, more controlled now, less aggressive. Judith drafted a statement she would never release. Caleb sat alone in the library staring at numbers that no longer added up. I stood in Beatrice's study later that evening, the amendment still in my hand. Why me? I asked her quietly. She looked at me for a long moment. Because you observe before you react, she said, and because you never once asked what you would inherit. That struck deeper than she knew. I didn't marry for the estate, I said. I know, she replied. They did. Outside the study door, Agnes paused briefly, listening, always listening. Control the paper, Beatrice added softly. Control the power. I looked down at the document again. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't dominance. It wasn't even victory, it was responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than anger. Later that night, Richard stood in the doorway of our bedroom. So what now? He asked quietly. I met his eyes. Now, I said, we let the review run. And if it doesn't favor me, I didn't look away. Then you'll finally learn the difference between entitlement and legacy. He didn't answer. Because for the first time since I had walked into this house 6 years ago, he understood something fundamental. The old woman wasn't the only one who had been pretending to be weaker than she was. There is a moment when power shifts so completely that no one argues anymore. They simply adjust. The review lasted 32 days. 32 days of forensic accounting, compliance interviews, asset tracing, and silence thick enough to taste. Agent Lillian Cruz did not return with drama. She returned with documentation. Caleb's private equity leverage had crossed into misrepresentation. Not criminal fraud yet, but close enough that lenders were prepared to litigate. Richard's informal reassurances to his son were documented in email threads that suggested coordination around anticipated trust acceleration. Judith's communications to social contacts about transition planning before any medical certification was filed painted an unflattering picture of motive. No one was arrested, but no one walked away untouched. The character review concluded on a gray Thursday morning in Beatrice's study. Graham Holloway stood near the fireplace, glasses low on his nose. Agent Cruz sat quietly at the far end of the table. Agnes stood near the doorway as she had for 30 years, witness without intrusion. Richard, Judith, Caleb, and me. Beatrice looked smaller than she had all week. Frailer. But her eyes were clear, always clear. Graham began. The internal review identified coordinated attempts to accelerate trust control based on projected liquidity events not yet authorized. While not rising to criminal threshold independently, the pattern demonstrates financial entitlement behavior inconsistent with fiduciary integrity standards embedded in the trust architecture. Judith inhaled sharply. Standards embedded by whom? By Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, Graham replied evenly. Caleb didn't interrupt this time. He looked exhausted. Graham continued. Under Provision 8F and its amendment, the fiduciary retains discretion to restructure beneficiary allocations in response to documented destabilizing behavior. Richard's jaw tightened. Restructure how? Graham looked at me. It was my sentence to deliver. I stood slowly, not triumphant, not theatrical, just steady. Primary distributions will remain intact under supervised compliance conditions, I said. However, discretionary liquidity privileges are suspended for 5 years. Caleb exhaled sharply. 5 years, yes. And my debt? You will restructure it personally, I replied, without assumed inheritance modeling. Silence. Judith's voice was icy. You're humiliating this family. No, I said calmly. I'm protecting it from collapse. Richard's eyes locked onto mine. And me? I met his gaze evenly. You will retain your beneficiary status, I said. Conditional upon documented ethical compliance in all external development ventures. He almost laughed. You're auditing my business now? No, I replied softly. The structure is. Agent Cruz finally spoke. The trust's internal controls are among the most sophisticated I've seen. Continued cooperation will prevent further federal escalation. That landed. Prevent escalation. This was the mercy layer. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. And if they do not cooperate, Graham answered calmly, full reallocation to institutional endowment. Judith went pale. You would give it away. Beatrice didn't blink. I would preserve it. Silence settled across the room one final time, not tense. Conclusive. Caleb spoke first, and for the first time his voice didn't carry entitlement. I'll restructure, he said quietly. No projections. No modeling. Richard remained standing, pride fighting with reality. Finally, he exhaled. You underestimated her, he said to his grandmother. Beatrice's gaze shifted toward me. No, she corrected softly. You underestimated both of us? That was the last confrontation. There were no dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just quiet recalibration. Over the next 6 months, things changed. Caleb sold 2 properties he'd been quietly holding under speculative leverage. He downsized. He stopped speaking about inevitability and started speaking about responsibility. Judith withdrew from social whisper networks and redirected her energy toward charitable board work that required real accountability. Image without substance no longer impressed her, not after nearly losing everything. Richard and I did not divorce. That surprises people when I tell this story, but something fundamental shifted. He stopped speaking over me at public events. He stopped calling my concerns emotional. He stopped assuming silence meant compliance. Respect is not demanded, it is enforced through boundaries. And Beatrice? She lived another year, clear-minded, observant, occasionally amused. On the afternoon she passed, she asked for Agnes, for Graham, and for me. Control the paper, she whispered. I will, I replied, but what I understood then was deeper than paper. Control the narrative, control the access, control the boundaries, because paper is power only when someone is willing to read it. After her passing, the trust remained structured exactly as she designed it. I remained fiduciary for 5 years as outlined, not because I wanted power, but because I understood responsibility. One evening, months later, Richard found me in the study reviewing compliance reports. You never wanted the estate, he said quietly. No, I replied. Then why fight for it? I closed the folder slowly. Because you wrote handle this old woman, I said, and you expected obedience. He didn't deny it. I was wrong, he admitted. Yes, I said gently, you were. And that was enough. Here is what I want every woman listening to understand. They will call you temporary, they will call you emotional, they will call you irrelevant, especially when you are observant, especially when you are quiet, but silence is not weakness. Silence is study. And when you finally speak, when you finally act, let it be with documentation, let it be with clarity, let it be with boundaries no one can bypass. They thought they were managing an old woman, they forgot she built the system. And they forgot that the woman they underestimated was never temporary at all.